the former spokesperson for the Soviet Union's last president, Mikhail Gorbatchev. Thank you for joining us. Thanks as well to former U.S. diplomat William Jordan, whose postings included Damascus. Joining us as well, Iranian-born attorney and analyst Ardavan Amir Aslani. Welcome back as always, sir.
Thank you for having me.
And from London, Julian Barnes-Darcy of the European Council on Foreign Relations, who, along with one of his colleagues, penned a piece earlier on where there could be positive signs and outcomes out of these Geneva II talks. We'll ask him about that in a moment. The France 24 debate, where you can always join the conversation on Facebook and on Twitter, our hashtag F24debate. Hardly an auspicious start to talks, that exchange between the UN Secretary General and the Syrian Foreign Minister this Wednesday morning.
Mr. Deputy Prime Minister, I'm sorry, can you just wrap up? Because you have spoken only 20 minutes, longer than 20 minutes.
Mr. Secretary, you spoke 25 minutes. I came here after 12 hours in the aeroplane.
Yeah, I know you have a lot to speak.
Few minutes to end my speech.
I'll have to give equal time to opposition group. So
yourself, you live in New York, I live in Syria. I have the right to give the Syrian version here in this forum.
Oh dear. You live in New York, I live in Syria. William Jordan?
Well, I actually know Walid Muallim. I'm not surprised at all that he insisted upon getting everything he was instructed to say out there, and to do it as brutally and as effectively as he could in order to make his point. I mean, he's under strict orders to get it all out, and that's what he was determined to do, irrespective of whatever it meant for the tone of these meetings. I mean, we all know, and we'll no doubt be discussing that in some detail later, the Syrians came to talk about one thing. The Syrian opposition, the United States, and those who were behind the opposition came to talk about something else. And like I said, Walid Muallim was determined to get all of his talking points out, however he had to do it.
Julian Barnes-Darcy, that heated exchange, did it pour cold water on your hopes that there could be some constructive outcomes at this conference?
No, because I think what we saw was exactly what was expected. I mean, I don't think anyone foresaw a dramatic opening today on either the regime side or on the opposition side in terms of moving towards meaningful compromises, towards the negotiations that would end this conflict anytime soon. And when you say that we penned a piece looking at the more positives, yes, but it was very much a question of lowering expectations. I mean, given the dramatic situation in Syria unfolding today, it's a question of taking the positives out of a very difficult situation. And I still think that this process, and particularly the talks that are going to unfold over the coming days, away from the cameras and away from the public limelight, offer greater possibility for some limited progress.
Some limited progress, but Julian Barnes-Darcy, the fact that there is no ceasefire, does that undermine all that's going on in Switzerland?
Well, my hope is that perhaps out of Geneva there will come some form of ceasefire. I think that any hope of a political solution out of Geneva is clearly daydreaming. The only hope you can have on the political front is beginning a process. What you can hope for on a more tangible, material results over the coming days is perhaps some kind of ceasefires, perhaps humanitarian access. I think that's the end result of the next few days we can hope for, rather than what we would have expected going into this.
Faisal al-YAFAI, do you see a ceasefire as possible in the coming days?
No, not on a large scale. But I should say that the comments of Walid Muallim really highlight quite how out of touch the Syrian regime is. I'm not quite sure where Walid Muallim thought he was flying to, given that it doesn't take 12 hours in the airplane to get from Damascus to Switzerland. So that's the first problem. The second problem, of course, is that when you, as the foreign minister of a regime that has spent the best part of 3 years bombing and massacring your civilians, come to Geneva and start whining about your own suffering, it shows that, frankly, you have no concept of what is happening on the ground, what's been happening for the last 3 years. And so that's why I think we are very unlikely to see any sort of serious progression. The two sides are just poles apart in what they want.
Ardavan Amir Aslani?
Well, I don't think that we can have high expectations in relation to this conference for a number of reasons. The first one being, we know who Walid Muallim represents. It is a Syrian government. It's in Damascus. They control the capital. On the other side, we've got a Syrian coalition. They seem to only represent themselves. The vast majority of analysts agree on the fact that this coalition doesn't have a huge following amongst those who actually are fighting in Syria, which are predominantly comprised of jihadist, al-Qaeda-affiliated Islamist groups funded by the Saudis. So here you have a situation whereby those who are supposed to represent the Syrian opposition don't have a genuine following locally amongst Syrian people and those who are fighting the war. And furthermore, one of the major participants that should have been there was disinvited, Iran. How can you expect anything to come out of this conference when one of the major actors in this conflict, who has sent in the Hezbollah, the very highly regarded performing infantry, having sent in the Al-Quds brigades from Iraq into the conflict, who is the main backer with Russia of the Assad regime, not being involved in discussions. So you're going to have a discussion whereby on one side you've got the Syrian National Coalition, who basically only represent themselves, a major actor who's not going to be there. At the end of the day, all you're going to get out of this conference is, if we are lucky, there won't be any ceasefire, unfortunately, but if you're lucky, we may end up with a humanitarian corridor or some local ceasefire to evacuate some prisoners or some people hurt in the war. It's very unfortunate.
So, Andrei GRATCHEV, if we listen to everyone around the table, it's already mission accomplished because they got the two sides to sit at the same conference hall, not even the same room, but at the same conference hall, and now that's all we can expect.
Well, it depends on how you define the mission. I think it's maybe a first step on the rather long way to eventually a possible solution, but I think there would be a necessity to pass through numerous or at least several stages before that. And so moving step by step and perhaps with a lot of work and pressure and discussions to be made rather, I would say, beyond the TV cameras, because after all, the opening session was a rather usual exercise in breast beating, coming from every side at the beginning of the conference. But once we were having a conference to which practically the two opposite sides have been dragged by force, or almost, by the initiators of it, well, you can only hope to get some result, again, within outside pressure. And here I would share your opinion, because I regret very much the absence of Iran. It's much more useful and much more practical to have Iran in and not out. I mean, with all its possibilities to make the conference or the eventual peace process collapse just because it's not involved into it, and by this very situation is not responsible for its results.
Faisal al-YAFAI, do you agree with, do you also share that regret?
Well, those are very interesting points, actually, and I think Erdogan made a very important one about the Syrian opposition. I think that's absolutely right. They really don't have the support in the country that any of us would wish, but they are the only political game in town. With regard to Iran, while I do agree that the Iranians need to have a stake in the process, at the end of the day, the Iranians have to accept the principles. And it was because they would not accept the principle of a transitional government away from the Assad regime that Ban Ki-moon disinvited them. The Iranians do have a role to play, but they have to play a constructive one, not a destructive one. And this is the case all across the region.
Ardavan.
Just one short comment, if you allow me, sorry. The Geneva communique that everybody's talking about, going back to 2012, talks, of course, about the implementation of an executive government replacing Assad by mutual consent of both parties. So this also requires the consent of the Damascus regime. So it is not as if as soon as you adhere to that communique, Assad has to go. Number one. Number two, this Assad departure story, we need to bring a certain degree of relativity into the story. In June, his mandate is over. There is talk of him running for re-election. So you're talking about 5 months from now. Whereas this war, horrendous war, where 100,000 people have died, is going on for three years. We're talking about the end of a mandate of someone who's going to end his presidency in 6 months.
William Jordan, one of the reporters saying, yeah, the Iranians didn't accept the preconditions, but neither did the Syrian government, and they were invited to the conference.
Well, exactly. I mean, I think picking up on some of the points that have been made here, I mean, I think that we need to not lose sight of the fact that this conference opening today was basically window dressing. It was the opportunity for everybody to put out their maximalist positions. Nobody went into this, including Lakhdar Brahimi, and I think anybody attending, expecting anything other than what we heard. And I found very interesting. I wasn't unfortunately unable to listen to the whole thing. But before I left to come for this debate tonight, Lakhdar Brahimi was lamenting that the Syrian opposition had taken so long to come up with its delegation, because one of the things he had hoped to do was to spend some time with the two parties. And remember, the real work starts on Friday when you have the Syrian government delegation in a room with the Syrian opposition delegation. What Lakhdar Brahimi wanted to do was really get into a discussion with both sides as to what they were and were not prepared to discuss before those discussions began. Now we are at the stage where we will begin those. And the rest of the world can argue about should Iran have been there, should Iran not have been there, what does it mean to have been, different interpretations of what Geneva I communique represented as sort of the baseline by which everybody's invitation was supposed to have been valid or not. But that's pointless, because it is only once the negotiations start on Friday and Lakhdar Brahimi has a chance to assess what kind of negotiations are actually going to be possible. And I believe we're going to be at Geneva, 3-digit number before we sort of arrive at anything even approaching a tentative agreement. We're putting too much into sort of the form as opposed to the substance now by focusing on a lot of what was today only going to be eyewash.
All right, negotiating, but again, it brings us back to the question. You say there are two sides, but of course, inside of Syria right now, it seems that there are more than two sides. We've seen fighting between jihadists and more moderate Islamist rebels. Over in London, the Daily Telegraph, quoting an unnamed U.S. source who spoke of millions of dollars meted out to rebel groups best equipped to take on the extremists, and quote, this in coordination with the Saudis. The article quotes a commander of the Western-backed Supreme Military Council as saying suddenly their weapons stockpiles are full. Telegraph regional correspondent Richard Spencer writes how ISIS, the Islamic State in the Levant, is changing the objectives. He says the peace talks have every sign of being a reversal of the Roman formula, si vis pacem bara bellum. If you seek peace, prepare for war. Both sides and their sponsors are using the peace talks to declare new war goals and seeking fresh backing. They are a military advertising campaign. Do you agree with that, Julian Barnes-Darcey?
Well, I think a number of the sides, most of the sides, are clearly not prepared to engage in any political process. They want to use the talks as leverage to confirm, whether to their own backers or to the international community at large, that they must be backed more fervently, that there's no other way forward. I think on the part of the opposition at Geneva, it's clear that they were very much forced to the table. They don't have much desire to be there. And truth be told, they don't really represent the groups on the ground who are doing the fighting. And those groups have very much said, we will not be part of the process. There can be no future without Assad standing aside. So I think, on that front, it's clear that they want to push on through. They're using the talks to gain wider legitimacy with the international community in the hope that that will push forward the fight. And I think their sponsors are doing the same. The likes of the Saudis and the Qataris have no desire meaningfully to enter into a negotiating process with the Assad regime, with the Iranians. So I think all of them are hoping that out of this process, more arms, more support will come their way. I think on the other side, the Assad regime has been forced to the table by its own backers, and likewise, they're not prepared to engage in talks. They see military victory as being perhaps a possibility. So in terms of the domestic parties, no, there isn't a desire to enter into a political process. What you can hope out of Geneva, and what in my view is the only hope of actually moving this in a better direction, is if actually those outside players, those external sponsors say, no, even if Geneva fails, we're not going to give you more material backing. This is not a path towards increased military support. We're committed to a political process, and you need to understand that absolute victory is not possible, and that you have to engage in a political process, long though it may be.
Of course, that's not what those sources are telling the Daily Telegraph, with even the United States providing funding. Let me ask you. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I think the U.S. government may be providing some funding, but it's quite clear that they're not committed to the military fight. And, the groups that they are supporting are marginal to the wider battle which is being fought, which is being led by the Islamic Front, not the Supreme Military Council. So, yes, the U.S. wants some leverage, but that leverage is very marginal, and it's clear that President Obama is not prepared to do what it takes militarily to oust the Assad regime.
Faisal al-YAFAI, let me ask you just very briefly, because we have to go to the break soon. From sitting where you are in Abu Dhabi, do you have the sense that the objectives have suddenly changed in the last 3 weeks, that it's no longer all about Assad, but now it's really about those jihadists?
Well, everybody is concerned about the rise of the jihadist movement, and certainly the ground has shifted beneath the feet of the politician and the political opposition. It is a huge concern. It is one of the few things that I think can bring both the Russians and the Americans to the table. I would want to pick up something that Julian said. It's a very important point. I don't think that the groups and the groups who are financing the war have yet fought themselves to a standstill. If you look at a historical example of the Lebanese civil war, peace only came about after both groups, or the many groups, myriad of groups, fought themselves to a position where they felt that there was no military solution. Julian's point that the Assad regime still believes it can win militarily is absolutely right. The fault for that does not lie with the rebels who have fought very hard. It lies with the international community who have refused to put any steel behind their words.
All right, we'll pick up on that point. I see some heads shaking here on the set. Stay with us. We're going to pick up on the discussion. You're watching the France 24 debate.